All right. So, how did we even get here with respect to our current monetary system, right? And for at least a little bit of illumination on that topic, we're going to look at a history of money and banking in the United States, the colonial era to World War II, and this is by Murray and Rothbard. And here's the cover for you guys to see it if you want. Hopefully, it doesn't shine too much being a hardcover. But, anyways, a little bit on Rothbard in general, right? And so he lived from 1926 to 1995 and was influenced by the work of Ludwig von Mises, Friedrich Hayek, Adam Smith, and Henry Hazlitt, etc. So those types of people, right? And if you follow this kind of space at all in terms of kind of like monetary or economic history and that sort of thing, the history of money and stuff, those are all names that should be familiar, at least. He was an American economist from the kind of Austrian school of thought, from what I can tell, and who's saw a lot about him in terms of being a libertarian and a leading theoretician of something called anarcho-capitalism, right? And a little bit about this book specifically was, it seems like it was first published in 2002. So it has about 490 pages. But if you noticed, it was published in 2002 and he passed away in 1995. And so that leads me to assume this is just kind of a collection of articles or things that he wrote in general, his research and that sort of thing that he wrote beforehand. And it was just kind of synthesized by the Mises Institute and published that way, right? So what is it really about? And it's self-explanatory, right? It's a history of money and banking in the United States, and literally from the colonial era to World War II. Like, the title is very explicit, not much like kind of superfluous copywriting, we'll say. But it's in 5 parts, right? So part 1, right, is the history of money and banking before the 20th century, right? And so it goes basically from the founding of America up to 1800 or so, right? And it really kind of pushes on the point of like how precious metals were used as money. It also talks about government paper money and how that played certain roles in like the revolution. And then he also talks about it, how paper money really influenced things during the Civil War, but I don't remember if that's in this section or not. There's 4 other sections, we'll get there. But that said, he also goes over private banknotes, the financing of the American revolutions, and then the beginnings of American banking and its bimetallism, right, when both gold and silver were used, right? And I'm not really going to go into the content itself of the book. That's why the book's there to be read. And in all honesty, it's not that big of a read, relatively. Of course, that's also anecdotal and relative to what I normally read. And if you've looked at some of the other books I've done book reviews on, some of those can get to 700 and 800 pages. Have another one of those beasts coming up too. But regardless, back on topic. So part 2, he really goes into the origins of the Federal Reserve, which he attributes to kind of the whole progressive movement and basically the failures of the national banking system, which I believe is also called the Sussex system, right? And really, he describes the origins of the Fed from the Indianapolis Monetary Conference route, right? And so one thing that I've noticed, because that's a topic I've studied a decent bit, multiple books and a lot of other side stuff, right, is to me there seems to be kind of 2 separate arguments on the origins of the Fed, and they kind of merge a little bit around Jekyll Island, but not necessarily. But there's one side that really kind of there's one side that really focuses and places kind of the foundation of the founding of the Fed on like Carter Glass and that kind of side of things, right? So really the Democrat side of things. And then you have the other side that's more, for some reason, deemed conspiratorial sometimes, only sometimes though, to where it really puts more weight on kind of the Jekyll Island component, we'll say, right, where it's more based off of like the House of Morgan interests and Senator Aldrich, and it places more of the, or I guess I should say, it blames more of the foundation and origins of the Fed on that party, so to say. But without going in depth into that specifically, he really chooses the Indianapolis Monetary Conference route, which really kind of develops into the Carter Glass and that sort of side of things, right? So enough on that, right? Part 3 is basically from Hoover to Roosevelt, right? So you have basically the Great Depression up to around World War II, right? And the dates are kind of fluctuating, which is why I'm saying like around and that sort of thing, towards generalized time periods, right? And so he talks about what he calls the Morgan years, which is kind of the early Federal Reserve, literally from the beginning of 1914 to 1928. And a lot of that's, from his argument, seems to be because the first chairman of the Fed was Benjamin Strong, who's really close to the kind of Morgan interest, we'll say. And that's not something that's like, in random article somewhere. That seems to be rather consensus and mainstream from what I can tell, right? He also goes in depth on the Fed during the Hoover administration, and then a lot into the New Deal and gold, right? Keeping in mind, being from the kind of Austrian school of thought, there's a lot of precious metals talking here. So definitely expect that sort of thing. And that. Part 4 is the gold exchange standard and the interwar years. And so between World War I and World War II, right? And really talking about, the politics of the price of gold, because to where when FDR was basically made monetary forms of gold illegal to hold for Americans, you had it couldn't be used in its monetary format by the generalized people. And that's kind of the defining characteristic between a gold standard and a gold exchange standard, right? And I'm not going to go into extreme nuance in this video at least. But basically, by saying the gold exchange standard, it was still the money was backed by gold, but it could only be it was used for international settlement, and that was pretty much it, right? So between countries at, say, year end or whatever the case happens to be, right? And that sort of thing. So not a regular gold standard. And he goes into how that kind of affects the global economy, eventually being parlayed into Bretton Woods, which he goes more in depth in part 5, which is the New Deal and the international monetary system, where he really kind of goes into the establishment of Bretton Woods, the IMF, and that sort of thing, and to get kind of more, and ends more into where we are today, obviously not in 2023, but basically going from Bretton Woods out, and the foundation of that system, and then you basically, that's the end of the book. For him, at least in any kind of generalized sense that he really goes in depth on, right? So why is this kind of a must read, right? So from what I can tell, this is really kind of the foundation of history of money and banking and the global monetary system, especially as the U.S. kind of came to be that global powerhouse, especially with respect to economics, right? And so it really pushes home that fact, right? And I don't know, I always like to end the book reviews on this and just kind of like going through it superficially, at least. One thing to note, I just happened to open up to this page. Wow. But one of the books that he cites is The House of Morgan by Ron Chernow, which I've also done a video on. And that's another big one, but definitely a fire hose of information if you so choose to read it. The audiobook's really good too, because it is a big one, to say the least. All right, and I'll put a card up in the top right corner for this video, especially at the end screen, just because of how in-depth it goes into very similar topics, right? And I don't remember when that one was published, but apparently before 1995. Right? I think it was in the early 90s or maybe late 80s when that was published. Could be completely wrong. Again, going off of memory from something I did months ago. But yeah, if you are well acquainted, I'll say, with kind of the Austrian school of thought and that line of thinking. And the similar are people who have done similar work, like Mises, Hayek, Smith, and Hazlitt, and that sort of thing. People who influenced Rothbard himself. What he says in here probably won't be too much of a surprise to you, but he does do a pretty good job of synthesizing the information. And one thing that really kind of struck out to me was his use of actual numbers, right? Because he cites a lot of actual data in here, to where he actually uses and is like exact as can be of like numbers of GDP in the year and so on. And he really drives that point home and actually giving numbers to things, right? Which may or may not be your thing, may or not be helpful to you. It tends to make it harder to retain the information, at least on a first pass, right? Because just having very data heavy passages and stuff can make it more difficult to see general trends, especially if you're listening to, like, we'll say only an audiobook rather than actually reading the book itself, right? Depending on how you best kind of learn or choose to read or go through books, we'll say. But he is pretty data heavy, so I will say that. So with that being said, that's all I'm going to say for this book in this video. I really just kind of wanted to do a general pass of what's in it, why you should read it, and it seems to be a rather foundational text for at least the history component of kind of the Austrian school of thought, at least from what I can tell, right? So with that being said, I will put a card up in the top right corner for the House of Morgan video. Again, I recommend that one. Not just the video, obviously, but definitely the book, even if you don't even watch the video. It's definitely a good book to read. Again, goes really in depth and a lot of things that you would be rather surprised on, right? Anyways, I'll leave this one here, card in the top right for the House of Morgan review. And with that being said, I hope to see you guys there.